Hello everyone, this is Nitpicking Nerd, and today I want to discuss the issue of the different timelines in the Star Trek universe. And in the last episode of Star Trek Lower Decks, they seem to be implying that the Star Trek Discovery Klingons are from a different reality of the multiverse. And so a lot of people immediately jumped on that to say this proves that Star Trek Discovery was always in a totally different timeline, which I personally do think that would have been the best explanation for not just the Klingons, but for all the continuity problems that show created, which are numerous. I've discussed them in many long reviews. And the Klingons were just one example of the many contradictions and continuity problems the Discovery created. And it's not just the visual difference, it's the fact that the Klingons even behave differently. Just a quick example, in TNG it was mentioned how Klingons don't care about how you dispose of their dead bodies, and yet in Discovery their dead bodies are so sacred they have to retrieve them, and they take their dead bodies with them on their starship and stuff like that. So there were numerous contradictions, not just with how things looked, but even in the dialogue. And maybe we can come up with convoluted excuses to explain each and every one, but really a much simpler excuse would have been to say that it's simply set in a different timeline which is similar but different. That automatically fixes all continuity problems. However, the creator of Lower Decks then came out and said that that scene was just a joke, and obviously he knew what he was doing, but he said in the same episode we also saw other Klingon ships transforming into sail ships, and there was one scene when the Klingons transformed into Proto-Klingons, the same that we saw Worf transform into in the TNG episode Genesis. So those were Klingons that did exist in the past of the same timeline, obviously, so we can say that the Discovery Klingons also existed in the past of this timeline. And so technically the episode didn't establish that Discovery was all in a separate timeline. But there was some article online that someone wrote claiming that it's now official that Discovery is all in a different timeline, and then a whole bunch of YouTube channels discussed this as fact. They all immediately said it's now official that Star Trek Discovery is all in a different timeline, but it was never really officially stated or established by anyone official that Discovery is not canon. They always claim that Discovery is part of the main timeline with all the other Star Trek shows. Now, obviously, there are a whole bunch of visual differences, but the excuse was always that maybe that's how things always look like, that simply we didn't see them because of the limited special effects or makeup effects and all of that. And so that's the excuse some people always use to say that the Klingons actually always looked more exotic and more alien. We simply didn't get to see them because of the limitations of the makeup. So the fact they looked human in TOS doesn't mean anything. So just ignore it, it's just a TV show, and actually they always looked like the TNG Klingons, or now actually they always look like Discovery Klingons. And yet when they establish it in the dialogue itself, that the characters are aware of the visual difference, that immediately cancels that kind of idea. And they first did that in Deep Space Nine, when they went back in time to TOS, and some of the characters actually reacted in the dialogue itself to seeing the TOS Klingons and asking why they look so different. So the moment they put it into the dialogue, with the characters acknowledging it, immediately canceled that theory that actually they always looked like Klingons. We simply didn't get to see that in their true form. And so the same now goes for Discovery, because we now see a Klingon who gets transformed into the different type of Klingon from Discovery, and he himself is horrified by it. That kind of proves that the visual difference is real even for the characters inside this universe. And so it's not just something we can ignore. So in TOS they all look like humans. Then in the Star Trek movies they suddenly had the head ridges, and then in TNG they had a pretty established look that lasted for several decades in all the following Star Trek shows. So TNG, Deep Space Nine, Voyager, and Enterprise, which was a prequel show, we finally got an explanation for that. So they established that it was a viral infection caused by the Klingons' attempt to genetically engineer themselves. They basically stole the human augmented DNA for the superhumans, and they tried to use it on themselves, and it had the side effect of removing the forehead from the Klingons to make them look like human, and it turned into a virus which infected a few million Klingons, maybe not all of them, but millions of Klingons were infected, and it was implied that after a while they'll be able to fix it. which can explain how come some Klingons we saw in TOS later did have ridges when we saw them in Deep Space Nine. So maybe they got infected and later they were able to fix it either with surgery or simply fix their DNA to get rid of that effect. And so we finally had a perfectly reasonable explanation for that contradiction with TOS. And so it became part of the canon. It was mentioned in dialogue, in the plots of episodes, that the Klingon look actually physically changed. And so it was not just some kind of make-believe that, oh, they always look like the TNG Klingons, we simply didn't see that in TOS. No, they actually did look like humans in TOS because it was established in the dialogue. Then came the JJ reboot movies, which actually had a clever way to show Klingons without getting involved in the whole discussion of how they should look like in the time period. They simply put the Klingons in masks. They wore helmets with ridges on the outside of it, and so we don't get to see the inside, and that way they can avoid this continuity mess of how they should look like in this time period. So we simply don't see that, at least until Into Darkness, which actually had a scene for some reason of a Klingon unmasking himself to show that he does indeed have ridges, and also he looked very different from the Klingons that we knew before, but it's not radically different. He didn't have any hair, he had all kinds of weird piercings on his forehead, but it's not so radically different. So it was a little bit annoying of why they had the need to even have this scene and why they need to redesign the Klingons, but it wasn't a radical redesign. So looking back at it now, it's not nearly as annoying as what they later did with Star Trek Discovery, which they kept insisting that it is set in the same continuity as all the other Star Trek shows, which I guess implies Enterprise as well, and yet they completely threw away the perfectly reasonable explanation that Enterprise provided for why some of the Klingons at least should look human in this time period, and this is set after Enterprise and before TOS, and so they could have simply saved a whole bunch of money by simply having some of the Klingons look inhuman, or do the same thing that JJ did of the Klingons wearing masks, and that would save a whole bunch of money for the show with the makeup, and they could invest that same money into better writers or better special effects in other departments. And I get it that they wanted to show a more exotic, a more alien looking alien, but just make them a different alien enemy and that's it. So why the need to ruin what became perfect continuity with the explanation of Enterprise? They explain the Klingon differences, but now they totally disregard all of that and make their own version of the Klingons that look completely different in every way. Suddenly all of them have no hair, suddenly they have elongated heads, and they look kind of like xenomorphs, and I think one of the artists who designed them even admitted that he took inspiration from H.R. Giger, who designed the xenomorph alien, and so they don't even hide the fact that they're plagiarizing other franchises. That's something I complained a lot about in my reviews of Discovery, that I keep seeing they're stealing ideas and visuals from other movies and other franchises and putting them in the universe of Star Trek, and then claiming this is all in the same timeline as all the other Star Trek shows, despite the many contradictions and obvious mistakes. And some people made the excuse that maybe we're seeing some different, more ancient tribe of Klingons who took over the Klingon Empire, so that's why we're only seeing these types of Klingons, and yet the show itself never established that. Any Klingon we see anywhere is always of the new design, and if they wanted to use that excuse, that would be fine. They had a perfect scene to explain that. Early in the show they had that holographic meeting of all the leaders of all the major houses of the Klingons, and yet all of them looked exactly the same. All of them looked like the new Xenomorph design, so they could have easily shown one of the other Klingon houses looking like the TNG Klingons, or one of them looking like the human looking Klingons from TOS. And that way we could have used that excuse, that maybe currently these ugly Klingons are running the Empire, but the other houses are also there in the Empire, and maybe later on they will take over, and that will explain it. And yet the show never bothered to do that. And then the fan reaction was very negative, and I think they realized that, and so that's why they tried to fix it in season 2 of Discovery, when suddenly they decided to give these Klingons hair. And they used the excuse that they didn't have any hair in the previous season because they were at war. Even though we had scenes taking place before the war, when they also had no hair, even flashbacks from Takuvma's childhood, and also when L'Oreal was locked up in the Discovery Briggs for weeks, she didn't seem to be growing any hair. Were they providing her with shaving equipment when she was in the cell? It doesn't make any sense. And suddenly, just a few weeks later, all the Klingons had very long hair again suddenly. And it looked even more ridiculous because they have those huge elongated heads, and now they have also hair on top of them, so they looked even stranger now, even more bizarre. And it's also funny how some of the Klingons' heads suddenly shrank, like L'Oreal I mentioned. And it doesn't even make sense because in TNG, Worf said that a beard is a symbol for courage for Klingons, and so how come in Discovery the Klingons now must have no hair while they're at war? So how come it wasn't the case in the Dominion War, in Deep Space Nine, the Klingons never shaved their hair? So it doesn't seem consistent. We can say traditions changed over a century and all of that, but again, it doesn't feel organic. It doesn't feel like it makes any sense. And the next show, Strange New Worlds, made it all even worse because now they redesigned the Klingons to look more like the classic TNG Klingons, and that's a good thing, but they never explained it. So how come the Klingons suddenly look more like normal Klingons? What happened with the Kling orcs? And it's also funny how in one episode they had flashback scenes to the Klingon world, the same one we saw in Discovery, and suddenly the Klingons in those flashback scenes did have hair. So didn't they say directly in the dialogue that all the Klingons were shaving their hair during the war with the Federation, and suddenly we're now seeing flashback scenes of the war with the Federation in which all of them have very long hair again. So now nothing makes any sense. So how can we possibly fit it all into the same continuity? And you know, Strange New Worlds came directly as an offshoot from Discovery. And so now there's even more contradictions. And also it's funny how in season 2 of Discovery, not only did they give the Klingons hair, but also their heads shrunk. They had very elongated heads, as I mentioned, but suddenly after they got hair, suddenly their heads became smaller. So it's as if they were trying to fix the mistake of the redesign, but they didn't want to admit it, so they added all these excuses on top, which also didn't make any sense. And now it's even worse in terms of continuity. I even made a joke video once to explain how come L'Oreal's head became smaller between season 1 and 2. And you know how she gave birth to a baby in season 2? She suddenly had a baby with Ash Tyler from back when he was still Vok, the albino Klingon, and so I made a joke video to show as if the baby was coming out of her head. So that can explain why her head was so elongated in season 1, because she was pregnant, and after the baby came out in season 2, that's why her head shrunk down to normal size, and then she suddenly grew her hair back. Even though when she was stuck in the Discovery brig for a few weeks, she wasn't growing any hair back then. So anyway, each time they tried to fix some of the continuity mistakes, they only created more mistakes. And then in Strange New Worlds, we see flashbacks from the war, and Klingons suddenly have long hair, and the characters themselves don't seem to react at all to the fact that all the Klingons now look radically different from the ones they saw previously. So maybe they know something we don't, maybe they know the real explanation and they simply do not discuss it on screen, that maybe there are different groups of Klingons, maybe not all Klingons follow the same tradition of shaving their heads. So I guess we can come up with convoluted excuses, but I still think the best excuse, the best explanation is indeed the multiverse excuse. Simply admit that Discovery was taking place in a different timeline. That would automatically explain away all the continuity mistakes, not just to do with the Klingons, but all the other ones as well. We can say it's a similar universe with similar characters, with the same names, some of the same events could have happened, but all the differences can be explained away simply saying it's a different timeline, it's a different universe, and the Klingons maybe never got infected by that virus from Enterprise in this universe. Maybe they got infected by a different virus that mutated them in the other way, the same way that Worf was once mutated into a more ancient Klingon. And so in that Discovery universe, maybe the Klingons remained looking like that even later, and that's why when that Schrodinger field affected the Klingon in lower decks, that's why it transformed him to the Discovery Klingon, and he was horrified by it, meaning he himself was shocked by it, he himself was not expecting that, because Klingons do not look like that in the Lower Decks universe. Every single Klingon we saw in the Lower Decks universe always look like the TNG Klingon. And one other detail I have to mention is that whenever we see Klingon blood in Lower Decks, it was always purple, the same way that Klingon blood was in Star Trek 6. And in all the other Star Trek shows, Klingon blood was always red. And that, I guess, is another continuity issue, because how come sometimes their blood is purple and sometimes it's red? I think I once made a very long video just discussing that one topic, so I will link it in the end of this video. And we can say the same basic events always happen in most timelines, but some of the little details keep changing, and so technically we can say every single episode might be taking place in a slightly different timeline, and that can explain all the continuity mistakes, and we can say all the basic big events happen roughly the way we remember, but all kinds of little details can be different between the various shows or even episodes inside each show. Now, I personally would rather to have a more solid continuity because I think it's fun to keep track of events and the history and the details. And if we start using the multiverse excuse, then basically continuity means less and less, and anything can happen, and anyone can come back to life, and anyone can do whatever they want when time traveling, and it wouldn't really affect it because there's a multiverse, there are time cops that are trying to fix everything, and so why should we ever be worried about anything big changing in the universe when there are multiple universes anyway, so who cares? And so I do think it's kind of a problem to use the multiverse excuse all the time, and I would prefer to have a solid continuity in one single timeline for the main shows, but I also realize that when a franchise is running for decades, it would indeed be impossible to always make everything fit precisely, and also it might limit your storytelling ability. If you want to do something epic, you want to make some kind of big change, and yet you cannot because your hands are tied because of continuity, then maybe in some ways it's better off to simply say that each show is set in a slightly different timeline, that maybe some of the events happen the same way, others did not, and that will give us the freedom to play around more freely with different new ideas. And so that's why I do think the best excuse is simply to say that there are indeed different timelines, and that can explain all these kinds of contradictions that would be very hard to explain away otherwise. So that's all I had to say about it for now. Let me know what you think, and we can discuss it in the comments below. And I will see you all next time. Bye bye.